Can
Okay, good afternoon everybody. Good afternoon to all my dear students and welcome to this virtual mode of teaching where I will be talking to all my first year students on this beautiful chapter called cheese. Now I know that all of us are having a little bit of knowledge on cheese. Many of us like eating cheese. Many of us actually dislike the taste of cheese. Had I been in a real-time class and if I would have thrown this question to the 70 odd students still sitting in front of me, how many of you like eating cheese? I'm sure 30 or 40% of the hands would have gone up. And if I would have gone to the next question and if I would have asked you how many of you can tell me what you know about cheese, or maybe give me some brand names which you've heard of, things which would have come down my way would have been Ma'am Britannia cheese slice, or Ma'am Amul cheese, or maybe Amul cheese cubes, or if you're very happy, maybe you would have said that Ma'am, you would have spoken about tiramisu, which is having a mascarpone, which is a cream cheese in it. But we need to understand that cheese is a religion. It's huge. And the very fact that cheese actually belongs to one of the big courses in the French classical menu, which is the fromage course, justifies that cheese is extremely important to the world. If we pick up some random cuisines, talk about the Italian cuisine. Think about it. Give it 10 seconds. It is sitting on the cheese of the world. Have you ever heard of a pizza which doesn't have cheese on it? Or there are many pastas which are based on cheese. So we will slowly talk about this chapter. We will progress. But there are a couple of guidelines which I need all of you to follow before I actually start talking about the chapter. Number one, as shared by all the group tutors in the respective groups, I would request you to please kindly keep your theory copies open in front of you. I had shared this presentation with all the students last week. The presentation is already there with you. You need not write down the presentation again based on what we are seeing over here, but please keep the presentation with you as a point of reference. Now, there is a lot of information in the presentation, but we cannot deny the fact that when the teacher is teaching, there is a lot of top-up information which is given by the teacher also. So, any form of running notes must be taken whilst I am teaching or giving you any additional information. And we have exclusively kept the last 10 to 15 minutes of this session only to clarify any doubts or any questions from whatever I'm teaching over the next 40-45 minutes, or any random question which you've got in your head belonging to the world of cheese. And also if you have any question from all those questions which I had given in the assignment. Quickly talking about your assignment also, please make sure you answer all the questions in your theoretical copy. Questions must be clarified at the end of the session, or you can clarify them by getting in touch with us also. And keep the questions for the last 15 minutes. And please enjoy the learning. So let's see what we've got over here. It says cheese, say cheese. So when do we actually get to hear say cheese? Whenever somebody's ready to take a picture, they say cheese. And when we say cheese, we've got a smile on our face. Isn't that fantastic? Well, if I put it in the other way, even when we talk about cheese and the people who actually like eating cheese, that puts a smile on their face. So let's slowly get into the chapter. And let's quickly outline what we will be studying about cheese in this specific session. We will obviously talk about cheese as a culture in the zone of food. We will talk about how cheese was accidentally discovered. We will also talk about what is the manufacturing process of cheese. We will also try to classify cheese on the basis of its origin and on the basis of its type. And then finally, towards the end of the chapter, we will find out how do we go about serving a platter of cheese when we are actually sitting in a high-end hotel or a restaurant, and what are the classical accompaniments of cheese. And we will also establish how cheese has an identity in the world of French classical menu. So let's progress with the chapter. Okay, so where has this name actually been born from? If we actually try to find out how cheese was discovered, and if we look at the world map, you will see it has traveled throughout the globe. It was there in Mesoamerica, then it went to Latin America, and then it covered the entire region of Europe, and then it went into the Central Asian and Asian market. But if we actually do a lot of research, we will find out that this word cheese has a Latin origin. If we take cheese as a product, and if you actually see what's written on the screen, the slide was not there in the presentation which I had sent you. Cheese, as a food item, has got a lot of protein in it. It's got a lot of protein in it, and the protein which is present in cheese is known as casein. So that casein dates back to the Latin language, and the Latin language has a word which is called caseus. So the Latin language gave you the word caseus, and caseus relates to the protein casein which is present in cheese. So that's basically how the word cheese was born. Many people also have the notion that the cheese has its origin in the Indo-European roots. Many people have been thinking that the word cheese, which means to ferment or to coagulate, or something which when it becomes sour or when it's off because of acidifying it, is actually what gives birth to cheese. So from the Indo-European regions, if we take the roots, quat, which means to ferment or to become sour, is another notion which gave birth to the name cheese. So if you're writing over there, I would want you to quickly just scribble Latin is equal to caseus, which comes from the protein in cheese, which is casein. And from the Indo-European roots, we had a word called quat, which in English means to ferment. And we cannot deny the fact that cheese is a fermented product. So I leave you with that for 5 seconds, and then I'm going to move on to the next slide. Please feel free to write any questions. Keep it for the end of the session. I will try to answer as many questions as I can towards the end of the session, or we keep the questions for whenever we meet next. So let's move on to the next slide. So who found cheese? If you remember what I used to tell you in most of the classes when we met last, that there is a story. Everything was eventually discovered, be it coffee or be it tea in the form of Camellia sinensis, or be it cocoa or be it cigar, everything was first discovered. Now, most of these discoveries, including coffee also, was done accidentally. So the same goes with cheese also. The history says that the discovery of cheese was a happy accident. There was this merchant who was traveling through the deserts, and he had a pouch on which he had stored a little bit of milk so that he could drink up little sips when he was getting dehydrated. But he didn't know that if he would be traveling for a couple of hours and a couple of days in that scorching heat, eventually the milk would curdle. Now we know today that the milk would curdle. But the big question is, did that merchant know so many years ago that the milk would curdle? The answer is no. So that merchant traveling in the heat with a lot of milk in the pouch over a couple of hours, and the milk coagulating and turning into chunks of protein, is actually the entire story how the cheese was accidentally discovered. Now we need to understand, number one, cheese was discovered accidentally. And number two, where are we standing today? It is, as I said at the beginning of the class, it is there. Cheese is there very well with all of us, no matter you go to whichever part of that world. Hence, I said at the beginning of the class that cheese discovery was a happy accident. It has benefited the food industry, and it is there as an integral part of the food industry. So, we've been talking about cheese, we've been talking about how it was accidentally discovered. We have found out how the Latin people claim that they were the creators, and then the Indo-European people say that quat and to ferment, and how they eventually discovered cheese, and then we heard of that merchant who was responsible for happily accidentally discovering cheese. Let's actually come to a point where we can truly define cheese. So what is cheese, my dear students? The first thing we would say, number one, cheese is obviously a dairy product which is extremely rich in proteins. Now, what is the problem? The problem is actually a good thing for us. Cheese, which is a dairy product, which when exposed to high temperatures or which when exposed to something which is acidic, changes its form. The milk changes its form from the milk to coagulated milk. And that coagulated milk is actually what? It is chunks of protein which we have decided to call as cheese. So let's look at the definition and quickly browse through the definition. The definition says that cheese is a dairy product which is derived from milk. And we all know that milk is a dairy product. And cheese as a product has a wide range. You can differentiate in between different types of cheeses on the basis of their flavor, on the basis of their texture, on the basis of the physical appearance. And it comprises of a lot of proteins. If the doctor, for example, tells you you need to go on a high protein diet, just start. It's got a lot of fat also, so we need to cut down on the fat too. But yes, cheese is thumbs up and it's a huge source of protein. So just look at the definition, quickly browse through, and once you are through with the definition of cheese, we will explore more into the chapter. Now, when we look at this definition, my dear students, there are some technical words which I have purposely put on the italics. I want you to look at the word Rene. Take a note somewhere. I also want you to look at the word acidified. Take a note somewhere. These are words which we need to eventually describe and define to properly understand cheese as a subject. So I'm sure you've written down Rene somewhere on the side and acidified as well. And towards the top, if you see, we've got the name of that protein, casein. Please make sure we take a note of casein. What is casein? Casein is the protein which is present in cheese, which eventually coagulates and gives rise to cheese. Now, when we talk about Rene, what is Rene? Rene is an enzyme which is added to cheese, which is added to milk in order to kick off the coagulation process. So Rene is responsible for coagulating milk and Rene is responsible for making cheese out of milk. So we will not stay for a long time on this slide. We have already spoken about it. This slide is actually telling all of us how, number one, cheese was eventually born in one specific part of the world. Again, there is a lot of, if every part of the world claims that we were the ones who created cheese. But when we look at the journey of cheese from the day it was born and how it eventually traveled, as what I said towards the beginning of the class, it was traveling throughout the European subcontinent. It went down and it made its way towards the Mesoamerican part of the world as well. And then it came to the Asian world. And in today's current age, it is sitting everywhere, irrespective of how important it is to whichever cuisine we talk about. Okay, so now we will be moving ahead and we will be stepping into the next part of the objective or the next part of learning in this chapter of cheese, where we will be classifying cheese. Now students, when we classify cheese, cheese is broadly classified by means of two sub-classifications. The first classification is on the basis of the country of origin, which is a very simple classification. If you remember when we had studied the chapter on tea, one of the classification was the classification of tea on the basis of the country of origin. Excuse me. So similarly, in the world of cheese also, the first classification is on the basis of the classification of country of origin, which we will eventually find out what are the primary countries which give a lot of cheese to the world. And the second classification, which actually needs to be researched about, is also the classification of cheese on the basis of the manufacturing process, on the basis of how much amount of whey is retained in the cheese. Now, if you quickly look at the screen, there's not a lot of sub-classification on the cheese by origin, because what we have to do, we've got to pen down the countries, which country gives what quantity of cheese to the world. But when we talk about the classification of cheese on the basis of the method of production, this is exactly where the important stuff is sitting. This is exactly where we find out what is a soft cheese, what is a hard cheese, what is a blue cheese, what is a semi-hard cheese, and what is a fresh cheese. So when we go to the classification on the basis of the method of production, we will be picking up each one of them individually, and we will quickly pen down a quick definition. So just quickly look at the slide, a quick refresher for 5-10 seconds, and then we will jump into the next slide. So moving on to the next bit on the chapter, let's further evaluate and find out a little bit more on the classification of cheese on the basis of the country of origin. Now we have, if you see technically, we've got a list of countries being written down over here. The first thing I want all of us to understand is, why do we have certain countries which give us good quality of cheese? It's not just about what is the quantity of cheese which is being made in that country. It is about the quality of cheese. It is about what type of cheese and how many different types of cheese are being originated from that country. So let's do a little bit of talking, and let's find out why there are some specific countries around the world which are famous for giving classical cheeses to the world. The primary factor which is responsible for making a country go on the list over here is actually the climatic conditions. We've got to understand that cheese comes from milk, which is a dairy product, and it is largely dependent upon the soil and the grass on which to the animal. So if you quickly look at it, it says the styles, the textures, the flavor largely depends upon the origin of the milk. And what is that actually dependent upon? That is dependent upon the animal's diet. Another, some more reasons which actually affect the quality of cheese and which goes into making a country a classical country of origin is, what level of pasteurization are we doing on the milk? What is the content of butter fat which is present in the milk? What sort of bacteria or what sort of mold are we using to coagulate the milk? What sort of processing we are doing in order to turn the milk into cheese? And finally, how long has the cheese aged for? Now, if you look at the countries, all these countries have got their own terroir, own quality on the soil, own quality on the grass. They have their own way of pasteurizing the milk. They have their own way of maintaining quality on how much butter fat they want to be present in the cheese. They have their own strains of bacteria or mold which is being put in the form of Rene onto the cheese, and they have their own manufacturing process. And different type of cheeses have different number of years for which it has been aged on. So keeping all these criteria in our mind, I have listed down some famous countries which are responsible for giving good quality cheese to the world. So my dear students, just quickly browse through what are the classical countries which give you a lot of good quality cheese. And if you actually do a little bit of thinking, you will see there are a lot of countries which belong to the European subcontinent. Let's quickly browse through the countries which are sitting over here. We've got Germany, we've got Netherlands, France, Italy. Obviously, Italy would be there, and half of the Italian cuisine has got a lot of input from the world of cheese also. You've got the United States, you've got Denmark, Swiss cheese is famous all over the world. You've got Greece, and you've got New Zealand. Now, students, this slide was not there on the presentation which was emailed across to you. So quickly look at the slide, and all I want you to scribble is the different countries which I have written down over here. Sure, Barnini. I will get the lights switched off. So, Natsar, can you switch off the lights? Students are saying they cannot see the presentation. Shubhayu, I can see you are writing that the slides aren't very clear. I would suggest you take notes whilst I am teaching. Verse to verse, if you cannot capture what I'm saying and if you cannot see what is there on the slide, please get in touch with me. I will definitely make sure I send the PPT across via a mail. We will find a way out. Okay, so I see some students are writing done now, so I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. Zinnia, I see that you have a question. Please keep that question for the last 10-15 minutes. I will try my best to answer as many questions as I can. So now we are slowly marching towards the method of production. How do we convert a vessel of milk into a packet of cheese? We've got to slowly identify the journey. Now, we've got some basic stuff sitting on this slide. We've already spoken about most of it. Number one, it says cheese is a dairy product and it is made from milk as the primary product. Number two, when we are talking about the quality of cheese, we've got to very clearly harp on the quality of milk. And the quality of milk is largely dependent upon what soil and what grass is the animal grazing on, and what is the quality of the diet which the animal is having as an intake. So I will be going on to the next slide now. So now we are jumping into the steps involved in the making of cheese. So the heading would be what are the steps involved in the making of cheese, and the first step is the step of adding a starter or adding a culture to the milk. The starter is also known as the culture, and in simple language we are finding a way to coagulate the milk and get chunks of protein. And what are those chunks of what are those chunks of protein? Those chunks of protein are nothing but cheese. Let's keep it simple. Forget about what's written on the slide. Let's talk about our experiences in the house. Think about it. I'm sure all of us have gone through this, no matter at whichever stage of life. You take a vessel of milk, you boil it, especially in warm climatic conditions. You boil it and you forget about it. Suddenly, what happens after a day or two, without even squeezing a little bit of lemon into it? You will see that the milk is off. I'm calling it as the milk being off. But in the world of cheese, the milk is not off, my dear students. the milk has coagulated because of the RNA, because of the enzyme, which is either number one, naturally present, or number two, which is artificially added to the milk. What has happened to the milk? The milk has coagulated into chunks of something, chunks of protein. And that protein is what? That protein is paneer, cottage cheese. And what is cottage cheese? Cottage cheese is actually a cheese which belongs to the world of cheese. And if we still continue looking into that vessel, we will see there's a lot of leftover liquid which is floating in that vessel. Correct, my dear students? So what is that liquid called? That liquid is called whey. So if you carefully look at the slide, you will see that the first paragraph has got two words in inverted commas. The first one is curds and the second one is whey. What are curds? Curds are coagulated chunks of protein. What is that? That is in simple language, cheese. What is whey? Whey is the liquid which is left behind in the vessel after the protein has coagulated. And what is this entire process of the milk coagulating into curd and the whey separating out of it called? It is called the process of coagulation. So important stuff which we actually learned from this slide is number one, the first step in the making of cheese is called as adding a starter or adding a culture to the cheese. What does this step do to the cheese? It separates the curd and the whey. The curd is further taken to the next step and it is finished off to become a packet of cheese, and this process is called the process of coagulation. Please look at the screen. Leave you for 5 seconds with it. It is there in the presentation which I have emailed across to all the students. But let's give it another 5 seconds and then we move ahead to the next sub-step. Okay, so I have two students asking me two specific questions. Somebody has asked me to explain what is whey again. Whey is the leftover liquid which is left behind the vessel after the process of coagulation. And Zishan is asking, ma'am, is whey also rich in protein? Yes, obviously, we've got to understand that that entire packet of milk is very rich in protein. So even if I'm separating the curd and the whey, the curd is definitely extremely rich in protein and the whey on its own is also extremely rich in protein. Okay, so moving on to the next bit on the same process of adding the starter or the culture, we need to understand that in most of the cases, milk will not coagulate naturally. When does milk coagulate naturally? In those regions where the temperatures are a little higher. Climatic conditions like climatic conditions of our country in the hot summer months, milk will automatically coagulate. Why will milk coagulate? Because of the presence of an enzyme called RNA, which is present over there. But we've got to understand, if we look at the countries which make cheese, you see most of the countries belong to the European subcontinent. And is there a match in between our climatic conditions and their climatic conditions? The answer is no. So the next question which must come in our head is, so how do these countries which are having cooler climatic conditions go about the process of coagulation? So what they must do is, because the milk does not naturally coagulate, they've got to artificially add a culture to that packet of milk so that they can kickstart the process of coagulation. It is as simple as that. If the milk isn't coagulating in my house, I cut a lemon, I take a chunk of lemon and I squeeze it into the milk. Will the milk coagulate then? Yes. So what is lemon? Lemon is an acidic agent. What is it doing to the milk? It is cutting the milk. It is coagulating the milk. So if we are in hot climatic conditions, the milk will coagulate naturally. If we are in cooler conditions, we've got to artificially add the starter so that we can kick-start the process of coagulation. We must understand, if we do not coagulate the milk, we cannot have cheese. Okay, so if we just quickly go back to what I just said, if you have been listening to what I've been saying, just a couple of seconds ago, I had used the word Rene. And I had mostly used the word Rene for those countries which have, if you would have been here, you would have told me in real time, ma'am, which have a cold climatic condition. And I know you've told that, you've written that in your copy. So what is Rene? Number one, if we look at the first line which is sitting there on this slide, is what is Rene? Rene is an enzyme. And what does this enzyme do to milk? I've got to take Rene, which is an enzyme, and it kick-start the process of coagulation. So if coagulation is not happening naturally, no bother, we get hold of this enzyme, it's put into the milk and it kick-starts the process of making cheese. Okay, so whilst you are still looking at this slide, I have managed to see a question which is sitting on the chat. One of the students, I'm unable to identify the name, has asked me the question, ma'am, how is paneer different from cheese? And my answer is, we call it paneer in our language. Paneer, if I put it into the English language, it is called cottage cheese. And in the world of cheese, cottage cheese is a type of cheese. Just the way mozzarella has an identity, just the way parmesan or gorgonzola or emmental or brie or edam or gouda, just the way these all are an entity in the world of cheese. Similarly, the cottage cheese, which we call as paneer, is very much living in the world of cheese. So if we continue with the Rene, and if we actually link this with the type of cheese according to the texture of cheese, it is a tried and tested method. It has seen that most of the cheeses which have Rene as a starter or a culture are generally a little bit tough in nature. And this paragraph sitting over here is just 3 lines, but I would want to actually talk about it. If we go back to the classification of cheese by texture or by the method of production, if you remember, we had soft cheese, we had hard cheese, we had cream cheese, and we had semi-hard cheese. What are they different in? They are all different in the consistency, in the texture. So how do we actually have a cheese which is a soft cheese and a cheese which is a hard cheese? What is the difference? How are they physically so different? We've got to understand, this is a little technical, so I would request if you can actually be 100% connected to what I'm saying. When we are going through the process of coagulation, we add rennet, we get chunks of protein, which are chunks of cheese, which is curd in technical language. So we've got a lot of curd sitting over there and we've got a lot of whey. Now, if I take the curd out of the way, we can't deny the fact that that curd still has a lot of retention of whey in it. It still has a lot of moisture. So the more amount of moisture which is pulled out of the curd, we've got to understand the harder the cheese gets in the texture. So cheese which has a retention, a lot of retention of moisture or a lot of retention, it keeps a lot of moisture in it or it keeps a lot of whey in it, is prone to become a cheese which is a little bit soft in texture. On the other hand, a cheese or curd or chunks of protein from which we have drained out the whey, we found a way of draining out the whey or the moisture, will eventually become a cheese which is a little bit tough or a little bit hard on the texture. I hope you guys understand what I'm trying to say. If you still have a question about it, keep it for the last 10 minutes. Junaid has a question, ma'am, what is Rene? In simple language, Rene is an enzyme. And in most cases, I've got Antarika who's asking me, ma'am, is Rene naturally present in the milk or is it artificially added? Rene is an enzyme which is there very much present in the milk. And this enzyme helps in coagulating the milk under favorable climatic conditions. When I say favorable climatic conditions, remember we are asking for hot climatic or warm climatic conditions. But what is the problem? This Rene ceases to kick-start the process of coagulation in cooler climatic conditions. So we've got to externally add something which is acid in nature, probably a little bit of vinegar or a little bit of lemon juice, so that we can kick-start the process of coagulation. Okay, so we go to the next bit on the making of cheese. Once we have managed to go through the starter phase or the culture phase and we have managed to coagulate the curd and separate the curd and the whey, we've got to go to the next step. And what do we do in the next step? We actually try to pull out a lot of moisture if required. If we are making a hard cheese, it's largely dependent upon what type of cheese we are making. So the next step is actually dedicated to drying up or pulling out the moisture from the chunks of protein so that we can get the desired amount of moisture in the curd. So if we talk about, you see the slide has got a heading of firm curd, but what I actually want you to understand is, forget about the slide. Remember those chunks of paneer, which were chunks of cheese which we had coagulated? We all have made Shrikhand in the kitchen. What is Shrikhand? It is curd which has got all the water removed from it, which has been put in a muslin cloth and which has been hung overnight. And what we get the following morning, we get curd which has got almost negligible retention on the water, and then we actually make Shrikhand out of it. So the initial chunks of curd which we get after the process of coagulation, we must understand that it has a huge amount of water retention. So these curds are referred to as young curds. Now these young curds, they are eventually tied in huge sacks or huge muslin cloths, and they are hung for, depends upon what type of cheese we are making, how much amount of water we want to lose out from the cheese. They are hung overnight or they are hung for a couple of days, and a lot of moisture or whey is lost from the hung curd. So once we have lost a lot of moisture from the young curd, what we eventually get is curd which has got lesser amount of water retention. Curd which has got young curd which has got lesser amount of whey retained in it. And what is this young curd with less amount of water in it called? It is called firm curd. So important stuff from this slide is number one, what is a young curd? Number two, what is a firm curd? And number three, how do we actually get firm curd? And the answer is by hanging young curd in a muslin cloth and leaving it to rest for a couple of hours or overnight or for a couple of days. So I'm going to leave you for a couple of seconds with this slide so that you can write what is young curd, what is firm curd, and how do we actually get firm curd. Okay, whilst you're reading that, I've got a student who is asking me over here, ma'am, in the startup bit, what does the word kaleidoscope mean? Kaleidoscope means it's a mixed bag. It is extremely rich. It's got n number of flavors or textures or characteristics to it. If the characteristics are confusing, you cannot understand whether it's flavor A or B or C. It's very rich. Okay, sure. Zinnia wants me to explain what is young curd once again. Zinnia, if you go to the process of coagulation, once we go through the process of coagulation, number one, we have got coagulated chunks of curd. And number two, we've got the leftover liquid, which is whey. Now, those coagulated chunks of curd is also known as young curd. Now, that young curd, when hung in a muslin cloth overnight or for 2 nights or whatever is the policy of that company which is making the cheese, after it loses a lot of water retention, it eventually becomes firm curd. I hope that answers your questions. Alex, a perforated container is nothing but if you go to the kitchen, your household kitchen, and you pull out that strainer, which is a colander or something similar to which is used for straining rice once we have boiled rice. It has got tiny bits or tiny perforations to it so that the water can drain off, and what stays back in the strainer in case of rice is boiled rice, and in case of cheese it is coagulated curd. Okay, there are some questions which are a little bit off this chapter. Ronak is asking, ma'am, how is curd different from yogurt? Ronak, let me tell you, very soon we'll be doing a beautiful breakfast execution, and there'll be a lot of input given to the students. There we will distinguish what is the difference in between a curd, a yogurt, and a junket. So for just now, let's just keep it to cheese. Okay, Annie is asking me, ma'am, how curd is related to cheese? Annie, we've got to understand when ma'am is talking about curd, ma'am is not talking about the curd which we eat in the house. Over here, we are referring to curd, which is a technical word or a technical term to those chunks of cottage, or to those chunks of coagulated milk, which we actually get after the process of coagulation. So these coagulated chunks of cheese are called curds, and the curd you are referring to is something which is totally different. Yes, Roshali, muslin is very much the name of a material. Muslin cloth is made up of muslin, which is a material. Okay, students, So what I want to actually do is this chapter, if you would have been in a real-time theory class, this chapter is taught over 2 classes. We've got a cheese part 1 and a cheese part 2. And we stop with the cheese part 1 with this slide. What I'm quickly going to do is I'm going to jump to the last part of the chapter where I've got all those questions from the assignment. We'll quickly talk about them, and in the meantime, I'll dedicate the next 10 minutes if you've got any questions from whatever we have covered today. I would request you to keep the assignment questions as an assignment with you. We expect you to find the answers to those questions yourself. Number 1, by means of this class. Number 2, by means of doing a lot of research. And number 3, with the help of the presentation which is emailed to you. Nevertheless, I'm still going to the questions on the assignment. In the meantime, if you have any questions from whatever I have taught today, my dear students, please feel to put the questions on the chat. I'm looking at the chat just now, and I will try to answer as many questions as I can. So I've got a student over here who's asking me, ma'am, why some cheeses are wrapped with wax? That's actually an excellent question. And that is from something which is not being taught to you in this presentation. But if you actually look at the question bank for your assignment, I actually have a question based on that. Now, when we are going through the cheese manufacturing process, you will see that towards the end of the process, when we are finally preparing the cheese to get it packed off, in many cases, there is a layer or a coating put on the cheese. Classical example, a dam which has got a layer of red wax on top of it. Again, there is a cheese which has got a layer of plaster of Paris on it. It's like an external casing. It's like an external coating. Now, number 1, all of these layers sitting on the top of the cheese, they might not be edible. So you've got edible layers and you've got layers which are not fit for eating. So there is not a set protocol that all the cheeses must have a rind. These external coatings, they are called rind. Like a citrus fruit and orange has got a rind. Similarly, the cheese may or may not have a rind. Now, in case of your question, wax is a type of rind which may or may not be used in case of making the cheese. I may choose to put a rind made up of wax or a rind made up of a natural rind on the cheese maybe. What is scalding? I have not covered scalding in today's chapter. So when we cover scalding, I will answer your questions. How is soil and grass important? Because it's common sense. The animal is grazing on the grass, which is growing on a specific soil. And if the soil is obviously of good quality and the grass is of good quality, the quality of milk which will be obtained from the animal will in turn give you a cheese which is on good quality. That is the reason why soil and grass is important. So Rupam is asking me, ma'am, what is acidified? Acidified is nothing but adding an acidic agent to a bucket of milk, like adding or squeezing in a chunk of lemon or putting a cap of vinegar into the bucket of milk so that we can kickstart the process of coagulation. Okay, some students are asking me, ma'am, why is it that in most of the cases when we use Rene, we mostly get a hard cheese? Now, the notion is not so that if we use Rene, the cheese will always be hard in texture. You must remember that the texture of the cheese is solely derived by the amount of water which is retained back in those coagulated chunks. If I withdraw a lot of water or most of the water, I'm more likely to make a cheese which is hard in texture, unlike a cheese which has got a lot of moisture retention and which is destined to become a soft cheese. Yes, Vaishali, if you take chunks of coagulated protein or young curds, and if you hang it in a muslin cloth, the longer the number of hours you will hang it for, more will be the amount of moisture lost. Eventually, it will reach a point where it has negligible water retention, and such will be the fortune of a hard cheese. Sakshi, rind is the outer casing on the cheese. Like if you take a fruit, if you take an orange, which is a citrus fruit, the skin which sits on the fruit is called, the skin is called the rind. So in case of cheese, some cheeses have a natural rind. It is developed during the manufacturing process, and in many cases, the rinds are artificially put on the cheese. If you've got time, just Google Edam cheese, go to the image. You will see it's got a beautiful red cover to it. What is that red cover? It is a rind made up of red wax. Edible maybe. Okay. So rind is the outer casing of the cheese, edible in some cases and non-edible in some cases. Okay, so somebody is asking me, ma'am, please help with question number 20. Question number 20 is list the type of cheeses based on the method of production. We just spoke about it. Hard cheese, semi-hard cheese, soft cheese, cream cheese, etc. Go back to the previous slides. When we are classifying cheese on the basis of country and on the basis of method of production, the answer sits on the method of production. Ma'am, difference between soft cheese and semi-hard cheese. Again, I come back to the same notion. You take a young curd, you hang it for lesser number of hours, you make a softer cheese. You hang it for more number of hours, eventually the cheese, the texture will get much more tougher. Okay, on your assignment, my dear students, most of the questions are having answers in the presentation. I would request you to kindly refer to your textbook also. And if we look at this slide where we've got questions of 5 marks each, I have purposely given you questions which are talking about the rind which is sitting on the cheese, and there are some questions related to blue cheese. I would request you to do a little bit of research and come up with the answers. The answers must go in your theoretical copies. Yes, Aryan, there is an option of aging the cheese also. There are in fact many cheeses which are aged, and we must understand that aging will furthermore aid in developing much more complex flavors and aromas to the cheese. Okay, so students, with that last question from Aryan, we will be ending today's session. We will definitely meet again. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to email any of the food and beverage teachers. Thank you for listening and thank you for attending my session, and take care till we meet again. Have a good day. Bye.